Good afternoon. So, I'm going to have to make a second installment on my weekly podcast. John Foster Dulles, Reaching from the Grave. So, like most everybody, I've been constantly doom scrolling on the news cycle and on podcasts, websites, Michael Savage, InfoWars, Glenn Beck, all that stuff. Ever since the events yesterday afternoon in Pennsylvania when Donald John Trump was inches from losing his life. So, as the story broke, my mind started going into gear as to the tactical mind. I'm former military. I've been in combat. I have engaged, and I've been engaged. I've been engaged by sniper. We have engaged snipers. I'm not a sniper, never was a sniper, but I have fired from a distance, both in training and in life. So, as the news was coming out and everything else, my mind in that world started to turn on, and my wheels started to turn. And being somebody who is a firearms owner, who's been trained in firearms through the military, practices, who has been in combat situations. Was trained how to shoot long range. Can engage a target up to 600 yards on iron sights with an M16 or an Armalite Series 15 type weapon. Just the wheel started to turn. Okay. So now that we've seen diagrams of the site layup, the building off to Trump's right, from where the shooter was supposedly positioned. And even before I saw the map of the site and everything else, right, and the diagrams, and I started listening to shooting distances and stuff like that, things just 2 plus 2 wasn't quite equaling 4. It does equal 4, but it was like 2 plus 1 1/3, right? 2 plus 1 3/4. In my thinking, okay? Given my situational knowledge, my experience, what I know, what I've learned, how I've used weapons, how I've been engaged, how I've engaged other people. Just not everything is adding up, especially, being a former combat soldier, being in combat situations where we had to be mindful of, like, for example, when I was downrange and I was a section sergeant or team chief, and we had to set up security perimeters and do what we were training, we did stand-tos and stuff like that, but just operating in that world the way that I did and being trained that way, first of all, the security setup just doesn't add up. So, where do I start? First of all, 150-yard shot at center mass, which is a torso, is in fact a very easy shot. I shouldn't say an easy shot, for somebody who is moderately trained in using an Armalite or an AR-15 weapon and has that weapon somewhere close to zero, that's a relatively easy shot on center mass. On iron sights, 150-yard shot at a head, that's almost target size. Almost like taking a center mass shot at 250 yards-ish. Because it's a smaller target and the silhouette profile will be smaller. With iron sights, it's a moderately or intermediately difficult shot. It's not entirely difficult. It's not an expert level of difficulty. Especially where the shooter was positioned. He was in an elevated prone position because he was at the cap of a roof. His body being elevated, or his rifle being elevated above his feet, but yet being able to offer a stable position that could offer him a good prone supported firing position. It's a very stable position. Okay. So, not as stable as if it was firing from a foxhole or from a table at a range or from a completely supported position, but from the prone, the way that he positioned himself was the most supported position you can obtain from the prone position. So he may not have been an expert shooter, but he knew enough to do that, okay, to give himself a stable position. The way that he positioned himself tells me that he probably, at some point prior to the event, reconnoitered the site. Meaning that he knew where everything was going to be. He was aware of where everything was going to be set up. He had prior knowledge of things, okay? And that speaks for itself. Okay? Whether he reconnoitered it the day before or a few hours before, which if he did it a few hours before or even a day before or even 2 days before, that does speak a lot to security lapses and to whether or not those security lapses were intentional. If you did it a few hours before, that really speaks to security lapses and to whether or not the security lapses were intentional. Because prior to the arrival of a VIP, several days before that event, there should have been security reconnoitering teams on the ground and a surveillance team in place to monitor that site. Even for people who would just go in there, climb up on a building, whatever, that should have been seen prior to the event. The red flags should have already been up. That elevated position within line of sight, within 1,000-yard radius of the VIP, should have been identified and should have been secured or overwatched. And it was overwatched. Had to have been. Unless it intentionally was not. Okay? You don't just go in there with the security team and leave something that open unless you're grossly incompetent or negligent, grossly negligent, or it was left open intentionally. Anybody with law enforcement or combat experience of any type would have been able to identify that, and that should have been secured. So my opinion is that it was not negligence, but in some way, shape, or fashion, that was intentionally left open. That's what my combat experience, soldier mind tells me. The proficiency level of the shooter, this is not a kid who purchased that weapon a month ago and just went to the range 2 or 3 times. He may not have been an expert shot, but the fact that he missed a small silhouette target at 150 yards, which is a relatively easy shot for an expert shooter, is a very difficult shot for a rank amateur. So places somewhere in the intermediary indicates to me that that individual either privately or institutionally received or participated in at least 2 to 3 months of firearms training and proficiency, minimum 6 weeks before he was on that roof. He had at least the basics of what we would call in the military basic rifle marksmanship established. Not well established, but established enough to where he only missed his target by less than an inch. He hit his target, but he missed the kill shot by less than an inch. And had the target not flinched at the last minute, or moved at the last minute, that would have been a kill shot. So in essence, that individual was in fact on target. That should have been a kill shot. Most people who hunt with rifles rarely make a kill shot on a large game animal such as a deer at center mass past 200 yards. Okay? And it's because of, the breathing, the trigger squeeze, adrenaline, all that. When you're engaging a living target, it doesn't matter if it's an animal or a man versus engaging a piece of paper, you are slightly more amped up. So your fundamentals, the opportunity for your fundamentals to be slightly off is a little bit greater, okay? Because you know that with the paper target, you have a longer time to engage, even with the pop-up targets on military ranges. Even if you, like at the 300 meters, you have 6 seconds. That's a long engagement time. It's a short window, but for a paper target where you're not taking an animal or a man's life, that's a fairly decent engagement window. Okay? 150 yards. I forget the time on the 150 yards at the BRM ranges. It's been 12 years, but it's an even longer time frame. And it's plenty of time if you have your weapon zeroed accurately and you're in a well-positioned or a reasonably well positioned, prone, or supported position to engage that target. Once it becomes a flesh target, it becomes a little bit more challenging because flesh targets can move. That's why, unless somebody is an expert top type hunter with top grade scopes, they can reach out, 6, 7, 8, 900 yards, 1,000 yards. But even still, those guys struggle with that, and that's most people who try to hit that far miss. And they have to fire off a second shot if the animal doesn't run. But most of your hunters, most of your relatively decent hunters, outside of 200 yards on a large center mass target such as a deer or an elk or even a turkey. Turkeys can be pretty large. They struggle with that. A moving target, flesh target, headshot on a human being at 100 yards for somebody who is untrained is very difficult. Somebody who's moderately trained or intermediately trained off of iron sights, that's still fairly difficult, not impossible. You have to be on target at least 20 to 30 seconds before eye fatigue comes in, but at least 20 to 30 seconds before you squeeze off the round and hope that that target does not move. If he was shooting for center mass, that's a pretty easy one because it's a larger profile. Very easy shot at 150 yards, a headshot. The difficulty goes up fairly substantially. So this guy may not have been trained at sniper level, maybe even not combat level, but he was trained. The fact that that elevated position was either unsecured, either speaks to the ineptitude of the security detail on the ground, or speaks to the intentional lack of sufficient security, because behind that building was a water tower. There should have been somebody posted on that water tower with oversight over the whole site. There were 2 snipers posted on top of buildings behind the president, approximately 170 yards away from the sniper. He was in clear view, even if he had a head profile above that white roof. He would have been seen. Even if he crawled up between the 2 buildings, he would have been seen approaching those buildings from open ground in all directions, and apparently he was. Nothing was done. If he was carrying a rifle, it would have been slung over his back, been carried at port arms, or even if he was just kind of carrying it, just kind of like Andy Griffith style, just kind of in his hand, just kind of walking along with it. That's not easy to conceal. So it's either willful negligence or incompetent negligence. my opinion, right now is willful negligence. In my combat mind, the more little details that seem trustworthy, not people grabbing for straws, just trustworthy, that I'm gathering as stuff comes in. And given my knowledge of history, and given my knowledge of the deep state and the things that they have engaged in very recently, and given my knowledge that alphabet agencies within the federal government, if a very important person poses a threat to their agenda, their willingness to collude with the mafia, with criminal elements, special interest groups, protest groups, their willingness to insert themselves into activist groups or co-opt them, or unions, that's all well-known history. The fact that the target was engaged immediately after, the fact that the shooter was engaged immediately after he opened fire and missed, and he probably would have been engaged immediately had he not missed. Tells me, or gives me the hunch, I should say, given my experiential knowledge of these things, it indicates or hints to me that his position was already known. And it kind of helps me to believe or to suspect that he was almost allowed to be there until he engaged. Let's go into history. Let's talk about JFK. It is known now, or strongly believed now, that the JFK assassination was very likely carried out in collusion with the Central Intelligence Agency, La Cosa Nostra, the Italian Mafia, and with the help of people like James Hoffa, and the Cuban American Society. Because of what happened at the Bay of Pigs, what happened with RFK and Carlos Marcello, and what happened with the conflict between Dulles, John Foster Dulles, and John F. Kennedy. John F. Kennedy, and actually this could go back to Eisenhower too, because now it's known that after Kennedy took office, even though Kennedy ran against Eisenhower's then Vice President Nixon, that once Kennedy took office, his number one advisor was Eisenhower himself. So we could even go back to the 1961 Eisenhower speech about the military-industrial complex. And we can also have a fairly decent understanding that Eisenhower was advising Kennedy not necessarily to do away with the alphabet agencies, but to bring them in tow. Because it was also Eisenhower's opinion that they had too much power. And Eisenhower was very angry at what happened in Iran in 1959, because the fact that the CIA was acting in the interest of the British MI6, when the Iranians nationalized their oil industry and pretty much took it away from British petroleum. So there's a backstory to this, right? We also know that Kennedy and Johnson were like Trump and Pence. Okay? And that inside the White House, Johnson was actually Kennedy's worst enemy. So Kennedy ran as a Democrat, but in actuality, he really was a Republican. Another thing that we know is that Richard Nixon, even though he lost to Kennedy in 1960, that he was not too terribly upset about that. He was upset at the press and the establishment. And we also know that Watergate now is, or was, was more than likely an establishment play to knock out Nixon. Why? Nixon was one of Kennedy's best friends. They were more so on each other's side than they were rivals. The 1960 presidential campaign was pretty much a campaign of, we've got the same guy running in either party. It's like, okay, which one do you like better? Because you look at Kennedy's politics, or Jack Kennedy's politics and Nixon's politics, and they were very, very close. So we know that the alphabet agencies have a history of kind of setting these things up. We now know from ballistics, from the Zapruder film, and other evidence that's come to light since 1963, that Oswald was not a lone wolf. Neither was Jack Ruby. We now know that both Ruby and Oswald were associates of Carlos Marcello. We know this. We now know that there was a second shooter, at least a second shooter, if not more, on the ground in Dallas. That does not mean that there was a second shooter in Pennsylvania yesterday, but that is to say that the stories of Oswald being a lone nut, a lone wolf, are lies. Out and out lies. We know that the Warren report was rushed. blatantly ignored exculpatory evidence, or not exculpatory evidence, but rather damning evidence regards internal agency, bureaucracy, affairs, and actions in 1963. We know that President Johnson wanted things done as quickly as possible and was just very quickly satisfied with the Warren report, even though it had more holes in it than Swiss cheese. So there's a precedence to this. What is the number one threat to the elite establishment who has the Margaret Sanger paradigm, the Klaus Schwab paradigm in mind right now? What's the number one threat? Where did Antifa and BLM get their funding? How come those people literally burned cities to the ground 4 years ago, and very few of them saw real hard justice? But yet, we're going to crush the January 6th protesters, who, even though they breached the Capitol, and if you want to, you couldn't make a case for them being trespassers, who were egged on by Mr. Ray Epps, who we now believe was a double agent, so to speak, but did nothing violent other than break a few windows. They are being prosecuted much harder than the Antifa and the BLM types who burned down downtown areas of certain cities across America during the summer of 2020 and actually killed people. Yet they get little to nothing. So, the number one threat to the establishment is holding a political rally, is supposed to have multiple layers of security around him, as afforded by federal law, local law, and as a former sitting president. In any large public event that he's engaged in. Yet, an elevated position well within 1,000-meter radius of him was left open for a mediocre marksman to, in plain sight, approach on foot with a weapon in clear view, mount that elevated position, open fire, and he's only engaged after he's opened fire, as opposed to being engaged while he was approaching, while he was moving into position, while spectators could clearly see him and were pointing him out. And if it wasn't for his intended target moving in a way which he could not predict, his intended target would have been eliminated by a headshot. That was only missed by a few inches and a fluke. John Foster Dulles, in my view, and given my processing, is literally reaching out from the grave. Quite literally. When we were downrange and we were being engaged by a sniper, say for example, in a minaret or from the top of a building, even if that sniper was within 100 yards, and we were, now granted, sometimes we didn't have the canvassing that this guy should have had days before he was on the ground giving his rally. This is another thing that kind of tells me that this might not be an accident or a lone wolf acting, that there's probably more depth to this. So say, for example, I'm in a convoy and we get hit from an elevated position from 100 yards, 200 yards away. Not in a tight urban environment, but a semi-open environment. It would still take a few minutes of scanning of all of us on the ground, or at least several seconds, unless somebody saw the muzzle flash. But even still, it would take some time to determine and then engage that target. So that kind of has me believing somehow that maybe somebody knew that that target was already there. Before that shooter opened fire, somebody knew he was there already because they engaged him immediately. It should have taken longer. At least a few seconds longer. That area should have been on constant surveillance for several days before and leading up to the event. Even if that individual blended themselves into the crowd while they were approaching, which is likely, once they broke from the crowd and started going in different direction with a rifle on his back within 1,000 yards or 1,000 meters of the VIP. The security detail should have, had to have taken notice. There's no way that they did not know he was there. It's almost, in a way, that this kind of has the flavor of Kristallnacht. This kind of has the flavor of November 1963. This kind of has the flavor of right after RFK gives a speech in Los Angeles in 1968. That was an inside job too, by the way. Once you realize what was going on between him and Johnson. So, what's really going on? .150 yards is not a hard shot off of iron sights, which they say this guy had. For a center mass shot, it's a reasonably easy shot for somebody who's got a modicum of training with an AR-15. The .223 or the NATO 5.56 round, they're slightly different, but they're close in size. So it's just slightly bigger than a .22 round, but it is a high-powered combat round. You can use it to kill a deer, to kill an elk. Even though it's a smaller round, it travels at approximately 3,300 feet per second. Depending on the type of round, it'll either, once it engages a target, full engagement. If it's a hollow point, it'll shrapnel out. It'll still make an exit wound, but it will slice and dice. Parts of it will slice and dice once inside the target. It can be armor piercing. 223 ball can pierce some body armor depending on the thickness and the grade. So it won't pierce all of it. It won't pierce like a Kevlar plate like they wear, in the military. It won't pierce that, but it will pierce a bulletproof vest that a cop wears. A 223 ball will. 55 to 62 grain within 300 yards is a kill shot on a large animal, or can be. 45 grain, once you get that far out. 72 grain is a kill shot on a large animal, probably out to about 450, maybe 500 if placed accurately. So yeah, this guy he may not have been a well-trained sniper, but perhaps it was just daddy in the woods. I don't know. But he was trained enough to miss a headshot by only an inch or so on a semi-moving target, 150 yards, which for a hunter, a trained hunter, not an expert hunter, but a modestly trained hunter, pretty damn good shot. A lot of holes in the security. the way they engaged him, it's almost as if his presence was known beforehand, because there was virtually very little scan time to determine the placement of the threat or the target from the law enforcement point of view. Almost instantaneous scan time. That almost never happens. It normally takes a little while longer to determine a threat when something like that pops off. It's just a lot of questions, and it makes me believe that the powers that be really want this man removed from the scene, and that they're willing, possibly, to go to very dangerous lengths to do so. It's not above the alphabet agencies to use cutouts to obtain their objectives. We know this. History tells us this. So what does that mean? I think that Michael Savage has a good attitude on this, in that, Lord willing, that Mr. Trump does make it to Election Day, that all of us at the grassroots need to be very mindful, very watchful, not a psychotic, paranoid type, tinfoil hat type, but very mindful and very watchful of the shenanigans that we can see at our level. But yeah, this is it's full of holes. And the more holes I see, the more I tend to believe, or tend to think, that yesterday's attempt on Trump's life was accidentally, on purpose, at very deep and high levels. You can call me a conspiracy theorist all you want, but in my combat mind, it just doesn't add up. This is AL-BINO, signing out. Pray for the safety of Donald Trump. Pray for our cause. Pray for our nation. Please, if you must act on anything, do it respectfully. Do not initiate any engagement. But be watchful. Do what you need to safeguard you and your family. And pray for the Lord's hand. Again, do not engage unprovoked. Be peaceful as doves and shrewd as vipers. This is AL-BINO. signing out.